So I had this dilemma. What do you speak about when you have a book launch? I don't want to just give one of my normal lectures, and I don't want to tell you what the book is about because I want you to buy it. So I had to figure out what I was going to talk about, and it really refers to the other point that Rashat made, and that is there is a process, a moment of creation. And it's more than a moment. It sometimes drags on for years, this moment. And I wanted to talk tonight a little bit about the various threads that I was pulling on about 5 years ago, and how this book became the kind of interweaving of those threads into something much more substantial. So the book began to take shape in my head. I didn't think of it as a book at this point. In 2008 and early 2009. So that's the moment we're going to look at. And 4 things happened to me at that time, which really engendered a set of diverse and disparate ideas and began to spark thinking about how those ideas might work together. The first is that I taught a class, which I've taught many, many times, and that is, used to be called SIS 201. Now it's called JSIS 201, The Making of the 21st Century. And I think some of my students are here tonight, and I want to thank you for coming, and you will get the extra credit. And that class, I've been teaching that class for a long time, actually, since I got to the University of Washington, not every year, but every few years. And every time I teach that class, I learn a tremendous amount. I learn from the students, I learn from my interaction with them, and from just re-engaging the material. And for some reason, in 2008, a number of things were coming together for me in that class that were very important, and I'll come back to that. The second is a local Temple Beth Am, invited me to be a scholar in residence and to give a series of lectures there at the temple in early 2009. And the preparation for those lectures also set me thinking. The topic of the lectures was the changing Middle East, and it's always changing. And I really began to ruminate about the Middle East in ways that I hadn't in quite a while. And let me just show you a picture of the Middle East here so that you can have something to do. The third thing that happened was that this was the moment when there was a short, brutal war, the Gaza War, which came right at the end of the presidency of George W. Bush, and just as Barack Obama was about to take the reins of power. And this war and the coincidence with the transfer of power in the United States led me to begin to think also about the United States and the United States in the Middle East, how it happened, what was its role, how has that role changed over time. And the fourth and final thing that happened, and I think this was an important moment, I took some of these threads that I have already mentioned, and I went on the road with them, and I gave lectures in several academic institutions. And at one institution, Tufts University, the Fletcher School at Tufts University, I gave a lecture in which I began to ruminate about American foreign policy, about the Middle East, about some of the things that I had been thinking about in my course. And it was a good lecture. And after the lecture, A professor, Susan Heschel, whom many of you have heard of, the daughter of Abraham Joshua Heschel, came up to me. I didn't know her. And she said, "You don't know me, but I want to tell you, make a book out of that." And I said, "Really?" And she said, "Yes, there is a book there." And I hadn't really thought of it as a book until that moment. And afterwards, I did. And that was in the spring of 2009. In the fall of 2009, I was scheduled to go on a sabbatical. I went to Israel in the summer, and then I was scheduled to go on a sabbatical. I had a fellowship at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, New Jersey. And I really began to fret. And I said to my wife, I told the people at Princeton that I was going to do this other project. It's a project I still want to do, but haven't. And I really now have this bug that since Susan Heschel spoke to me, I have this bug to do this book. So she said, "Well, you know what? We're going to Israel. Find yourself a nice cafe and sit every day and write in that cafe and see where you're at the end of the summer." And that was wonderful advice, and I did that, and it went well. It actually went really nicely. So when we got to Princeton, I, with some trepidation, went to the administration of the Institute and said to them, I know I have this fellowship, and I told you I wrote this whole proposal on how I'm going to do this other project. But what do you think? I have this other book I'd like to do on the Middle East. And they looked at me and they said, "We don't care what you do." And I said, "Great." And that's when I began the book and really wrote drafts of a number of the chapters, and then have worked on it since that time and finished the book it's about 2 years ago, and then it goes through this long production process. So let me go back to those moments that I was referring to. And the first was the course that I told you about, the making of the 21st century, which is really, by the way, about the 20th century. And one of the heroes of that course is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And in fact, the course begins with Roosevelt. It begins with the collapse of the 19th century world order, of Britain as the leading world power, of the tremendous dislocation of World War I, the Depression, and World War II. And even in the midst of World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt spoke to some of his aides and said, "We have to think about how we're going to construct the world afterwards, because the United States is going to be the only power left standing, and we want to make sure we don't have a world like we've seen over the last 30 years. So he came up with all sorts of ideas, the International Monetary Fund and the United Nations, and many, many ideas. But one key moment came right as the Yalta Conference was finishing in February of 1945. And here is a very famous, almost iconic picture. From Yalta, Roosevelt on the right took a very perilous journey. The war was still being fought through the Mediterranean, and ended up on the Suez Canal, at the Bitter Lake on the Suez Canal. And he met there with the first king of Saudi Arabia, Abdulaziz there, and you see him sitting there. Now this was, that Roosevelt undertook this journey at all was mind-boggling. He was weeks away from death, and the pictures of him at Yalta actually look like he's about to die. Here he actually looks somewhat better, somewhat revived by the sun of the Middle East, maybe. And so the question that I pose to students is why? Why would he undertake such a journey while the war is still being fought? And there's no clear answer. He never said why he did it. But I infer that he was making a couple of statements. And one was that the United States was going to be a player in many regions around the world, not just in Europe, not just in East Asia, but in all kinds of places, new places in the world where it really hadn't engaged on a regular basis prior to that time. And the Middle East was a key area. Obviously, there was oil, and while the United States was self-sufficient in oil, he was making a statement, too, that he was watching out for the future allies of the United States who were not self-sufficient in oil. And even then, there was some thinking that the United States wouldn't remain self-sufficient in oil forever. So this was a very important moment when he made this voyage to the Middle East, and it begins the United States' role as an everyday, permanent player, one of the regional powers in the Middle East. All sorts of subjects came up there. One, not surprisingly, was Palestine, which was already a tinderbox. And if the United States didn't know it then, it didn't know it beforehand. It knew once it talked to Abdul Aziz that this problem wasn't going to go away easily, and they simply left it as a disagreement between the two. Now, what was Roosevelt's conception of how this post-war world would look? How would it be constructed? And a colleague of mine, Bruce Cummings, put it very nicely once. He said, Roosevelt had a conception of the world as being governed by big powers that shared in the governance of the world, and that the United States, in this corporation of big powers, had a 51% share. Okay? It was the majority holder, but not by much. That is, it had to take seriously the desires, the needs, and the interests of the other powers if it was going to keep this governance structure intact. And he wrote a very important article in, I believe it was in Look magazine, in the 1940s, in which he talked about the four policemen, which became the basis of the Security Council, that major powers would oversee the world, and that there would be institutions like the International Monetary Fund which would oversee capital movement and monetary relations and other things of this sort. So this 51% notion was a very important notion to him. Now, what underlay it, we don't know, because he didn't live and we couldn't interview him. But if we judge from the presidents who followed him, what was worrying him, why wouldn't the United States just be the hegemonic power, the imperial power, and really disregard the whims and wills of these broken other powers who had been so badly battered during World War II? And part, I think, of what bothered him was the question of how you manage to be everywhere all the time and not go bankrupt. Actually, this was explicitly stated later by President Eisenhower, who said this is the problem that every president must encounter now. We are a world power. We are everywhere, Africa, Latin America, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and so on. And how are we going to prevent ourselves from going bankrupt? And this notion of sharing power, of offloading responsibilities, but also getting others to share in the expenses, was an idea that underlay what the president did. Now, he didn't live to see this through. Even the United Nations conference came after he died. And his successor was Harry Truman. And Harry Truman actually was a very interesting figure in his own right. I think he, too, had some of the same concerns about bankrupting the United States, but he had a different vision. It wasn't a 51% holding in this stock company, but as Cummings said, it was an 80% holding. That is, the United States was going to be much more assertive and take ownership of the reconstruction of the world, and particularly after the beginning of the Cold War, around 1947 or 48, Truman really felt it necessary to undo the kind of generosity of shared governance that FDR had in mind. A second thing that happened during the Truman administration, besides this kind of edging towards a greater share of governance, was the birth of what we call the national security state. There were a number of National Security Council resolutions, the most famous being NSC 68. And these resolutions created the institutions that we know today and are still creating the kinds of problems today that they created back then. This is the CIA and the other intelligence agencies. There were a whole set of agencies coupled by the creation of military bases around the world. Today, the United States has somewhere, nobody knows the exact count, outside of government, but it's probably somewhere in the vicinity of 600 to 900 military bases on foreign soil. It's a lot of bases. And so what was beginning to happen was a kind of bifurcation of American policy, or tension, maybe bifurcation is too strong a word, a tension in which on the one hand the presidents were worrying about this bankrupting the country, and on its own, this national security state, like an octopus, began to spread, began to gain large budgets, began to have a presence abroad, began to do things that presidents no longer controlled or knew of. And we see the recent scandals with the NSA really reflect the kind of contemporary results of the creation of this national security state. So I was interested in this. How was the United States going to reconcile these competing impulses? And particularly, how was this going to be played out? Now, what I say in the book is that the United States had a dual model, or maybe don't call it dual model, but a model of how this was going to work. It was going to work in the following way. Based on the experience in Europe, the United States was going to find a really good ally, a reliable ally, a strong ally, that in the particular region would work as an interlocutor, would also, the United States could offload responsibility to that power, and would bear some of the economic burden in governance of the region. And the model was Britain. Okay, and later Germany, but Britain to begin with. That Great Britain was going to be the kind of ally that the United States would look for in other regions of the world. Loyal, strong, close, willing to take on responsibility. That's not to say there weren't tensions between the United States and the UK. We saw them in the Suez War of 1956. There were other cases, but in fact, that alliance really weathered a lot. And the second part of this dual strategy was to create a military alliance. NATO was the model. And through the military alliance, the United States would also be sharing governance, sharing security issues, sharing the costs of the Cold War, as it turned out. Now, the difficulty was it didn't work well elsewhere. They took this model and they applied it, and they built military alliances. In the Middle East, there is a string of names of military alliances that were built and failed. The most famous name that people probably would recognize is the Baghdad Pact. And in other places, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, in other places, the United States tried to build these military alliances and was constantly looking for its Britain in each region. And a lot of the story of the book is the search for that Britain in the Middle East. So that is how my course played into my thinking. The second set of ideas came out, as I mentioned, of these talks at Temple Beth Am about the changes in the Middle East. And I will just mention a few. The center of the book deals with how the Middle East changed. And sort of after I had written an entire draft and I was ready to send it off, I looked at this, I kept looking at this chapter and I'm saying, something's happening here and I'm not catching it. And then one day it came to me that if you look at these changes in the Middle East, and I'm talking about major transformative changes, what I call changing the actual regional dynamics, in the Middle East, they happened almost like clockwork, I discovered, every 30 years. In 1918, the Middle East was totally changed as it went from the part of the Ottoman Empire to a new system of mandates and semi-independent states and British and French imperialism. That lasted exactly 30 years. And in 1948, you have yet another transformation. This transformation lasts from about 48 to 52, in which you have the withdrawal of the British, not entirely, but mostly, and particularly from Palestine. You have the creation of Israel. You have the revolution in Egypt in 1952, the Free Officers' Revolution, which changes the face of the Middle East and creates a whole new Middle East. I'll talk about that in a moment. And what's 30 years after that is 1979. And my arithmetic is not that good. And so 1979, within a few days, you have two major transformative changes occurring in the Middle East. One is the Iranian Revolution, the overthrow of the Shah, and the creation of the Islamic Republic in Iran. And you have the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, which really changes all calculations. It was amazing. So again, 30 years. And then 30 years later, in 2011, I told you my arithmetic's not that good. I actually started in 2009. I could tell you why in question and answer. But in 2011, you have the Arab Spring and the process of transformation that we're seeing right before our eyes, which hasn't finished playing out yet. So every 30 years, something major is happening. And the U.S. has taken its kind of model of how it's going to act in the world as a static model of find my ally, make my military alliance, and meanwhile these major transformations in regional dynamics are occurring, and so the U.S. does well sometimes and doesn't do well some other times. Let me talk about just quickly some of the changes that occurred in this key period that I'm looking at. One is the ideological basis of the Middle East changed. In 1952, with the Free Officers' Revolution, you had the birth of the period of Arab nationalism. Arab nationalism had roots before 52, but it was really Nasser who brought an entirely new power to the region that was unheard of previously, that mobilized masses, that touched people's hearts, and that defined the fault lines within the Middle East. So it was monarchical, old regimes against the new Arab nationalist regimes. It was the Arab nationalist states against Israel and other lines of this sort. And this gave way in 1979 to political Islam being the dominant ideology, displacing Arab nationalism. Arab nationalism faltered in the 1967 war, the Arab-Israeli War of that year, and it really never regained its footing. We're watching in Egypt as there's an attempt to kind of revive some of the old Arab nationalist spirit, but it was dead, really, and it was displaced by political Islam. A second change was, let's just get this map up here if we can. So the Muslim world is about 90% Sunni and about 10% Shia. Here you have the dark gray zone is Shia zones in the Middle East, and the light gray is Sunni. And what you had, and I'm not going to belabor this, and we could talk more about it if you want to in the question and answer period, is a long, long period in which Sunnis dominated Shiites, not only politically, but economically. They tended to be at the top of the economic ladder, and the Shia at the bottom of the economic ladder, socially, culturally, they're in almost every way. And with the Iranian Revolution, you had a kind of Shia revival and a much more assertive Shia population, and this was reflected in Lebanon with the growth of Hezbollah, which is a Shia organization, and elsewhere. And it really led now to a kind of new pride among the Shia, but also a new assertiveness that began to play itself out, and we see itself playing in 2014 in very, very destructive ways. Now I'm going to go to that other map, back to this map over here. And the last change I'll mention right here is that between 1952 and around 1980, that 30-year period, the power centers in the Middle East were right here in the core of the Middle East. It was largely Egypt, to some degree Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Syria. This was the core. The Arab nationalism was the core strength. These were the regional powers that you wanted to watch. This is where the newspapers were looking, okay? If you look today in this post-1979 period, all those countries have been hollowed out. Iraq, of course, Syria, we see what's happening today, and Egypt. None of them is a major, major player. They're still big countries and important in many ways, what happens to them, but they're not the kind of regional dominating players they were before. And the domination has gone to the periphery and to the non-Arab states, to Iran, to Turkey, and to Israel. Those have become the players if you want to understand the regional dynamics, and I try to work some of that out in the book itself. The third, whoops, I sort of moved that forward, but that's okay. The third element I wanted to talk about was how I was thinking about, as the Gaza war happened, how I began to think about how U.S. leaders navigated this very difficult area, this very difficult region. And I was particularly trying to come to terms with what had happened in the 2000s. And what I look at in the book is how in the post-Cold War years of the 1990s, a group of important and brilliant and difficult men, thinkers in Washington, D.C., began to reconceive the United States in the world. We call these people now neoconservatives. They included Paul Wolfowitz and Dick Cheney, and it's already started in the very tail end of the first Bush administration in 1992. We have the first major paper that they write. And then when they're out of power during the Clinton years, they begin to have seminars, write papers, and really conceive of a new way of thinking about the United States. And hats off to them. It had to be done. The Cold War was over, and the Cold War was the lens that was used over and over again as almost the only lens that the American leaders used during the Cold War. What lens were they going to use now? And these men developed a kind of triumphalist view, which was that the United States is the only world power, and it still is today. It's the only power who is an everyday player in every continent of the world. There is no other power like that. There may be someday, maybe Russia, maybe China, who knows. But right now, the United States is the only power, and they looked at that, and they began to develop a conception of the American role in the world, which really did away with the old military alliances ideas, which did away with partnerships and shared governance. It did away not only with the 51% notion, but it even did away with the 80% notion, saying that the United States really was the dominant power and had to play that world role on its own. And the old Europe, as they called it, was not going to help. Old Europe meant France and Germany and Britain, who they disdained. And they took a new tack into the 21st century, and the attacks of September 11th, 2001 were a catalyst, were an opportunity to put these thoughts, to put these conceptions to work. And I discuss this in the book, and I discuss the disastrous results that this conception brought the United States. It brought it into 3 wars, the war on terror, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, that never seemed to end, that went through the entire decade, that drained the United States. Usually we think of the 2008 financial crisis as precipitated by the prime mortgages and the banking crisis, and I think that's true to an extent, but it's not emphasized enough how much these wars drained the United States, put it into a position where it was not able to cope sufficiently with the financial crisis that occurred in 2008 because of the trillions of dollars that were spent on these wars. In fact, just what Eisenhower had warned against, and Truman had thought about, and FDR had probably thought about, the bankrupting of the United States actually occurred when it overextended itself into an imperial power in the 2000s. And I discussed this, and I sort of was trying to come to terms with it as Obama was taking the reins of power, and asking myself, what now? What can we do at this point? So I'm going to close by, of course, reading from the book. It won't, not too long, I promise, just a few paragraphs. Despite all the forces pulling the United States away from the Middle East, Obama, like Nixon and other previous presidents, found that the United States could not seem to get up and walk away from that troubled area. The threats the region posed, its critical geostrategic position, its bountiful mineral resources, the penchant to produce crisis after crisis, and the now substantial history of U.S. commitments to Mideast countries all point to the fact that the United States could not and will not turn its back on the Middle East. What is much less clear is what kind of role America will take in the region. The legacy of the extended recession and the even more prolonged wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the worldwide war on terror dictates that the United States cannot be the sort of hegemonic power that many imagined it would be after World War II or again after the Cold War. Realists always worried about the United States operating abroad beyond its resources and capacities to influence events. If anything, the economic and security crises of the first decade of the 21st century heightened these worries and demanded a trimming of America's sails. The idea of an imperial America, of a superpower with an 80% or greater share of world leadership, if it ever had any merit, can now be assigned to the dustbin of history. But a more limited United States does not mean withdrawing into its shell. It is still the world's leading power, and with that comes international responsibility. The abject failures in American foreign policy in this century's first decade demand now not a shirking of key international role for the country, but a rethinking of America's global responsibilities in making the international arena as peaceful and friction-free as possible. At the center of that reassessment lies the volatile Middle East. The United States' experience in the Middle East has been like a checkerboard. There have been triumphant moments. Here we have Anwar Sadat, Jimmy Carter, and Menachem Begin announcing the treaty of the Egyptians and Israelis at Camp David. Here we have Bill Clinton and Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat. But there have been also moments of abject failure. And the question is now whether the United States has the wherewithal, the leadership, and the foresight to understand the very complex region it's in and begin to nudge it. It can't do much more than that. Nudge it towards some resolution of its multiple crises. Thank you.